What's up, y'all? Long story short, I played probably my best game ever yet on chess.com with a 3,350 performance rating. Let's get into the game. Of course, you can already guess the opening. Bird's opening. I play f4. My opponent, the indubitable Siemba, he's just an FM from the Netherlands. I really don't know anything more about him. Good player though. He plays knight f6, knight f3, g6, e3. We get our classic bird setup. Technically, I did something slightly incorrect than I recommended in my course on the bird. In my course on the bird, I recommend c4 here. And we get to slightly different positions. The idea of c4 is that in some positions, we're going to save the tempo and immediately launch our pawn to e4. Regardless, I played e3, bishop g7, c4. My opponent castles. I play knight c3, he plays d6. Very hyper-modern setup. These are notoriously risky against the bird because with the bird, you're already getting some space. Your opponents think it's a joke, so they think they can just rest easy and not really play anything serious against it. And, you know, all the circumstances are already in place for this guy to get steamrolled here. He's not treating it seriously. He's just moving around his pawns. He's adopted sort of a king's Indian structure, but as we're going to see, things are going to get quite bad quite quickly. I play d4. Now in this position, he needs to play something like c5 or prepare e5 with knight bd7 and e5. But one way or another, he needs to get that center going, and he needs to get it going fast. He didn't really realize the urgency, though. He just played b6. I pushed my pawn to e4. He played bishop b7. Going for that hyper-modern setup. This is classic hyper-modern stuff. Two bishops are fianchettoed, shadowed, and no pawns are in the center. Something's going to give soon. What's going on? Something is up with my electricity here in Paraguay. It just, the power is going off every, Anyway, whatever. So, bishop d3, reinforcing the pawn on e4, defending it adequately. My opponent plays c5. This point, though, it's a bit too late for this. It's too little, and it's too late. I play d5 here. I'm crunching on the bishop. The pawn is completely solid here. Can I make that pawn? Let me make that pawn green. Beautiful pawn there. Bishop is bad. Knight is also bad. Knight is pointed into a lot of well-defended pawns. There's really nothing left for the knight or bishop to do. And more than that, look at my center. My center is already really far out. I got four great pawns here. I have the classic green shepherd variety in the center. And in many cases, I could really easily push e5. It's not like the game is just stopping there. My opponent plays a6. He's playing for some b5 funny business. We're not going to allow it. We're going to play a4. Completely contain him. He's not getting out of this alive. This is quite an interesting position. It started out as a bird, but it's quickly become something that normally you get in d4 openings. You often get this in d4 positions against the kings and in when you take a lot of space and your opponent just ignores it for too long. I've had many of these positions for my d4 games, and playing this game, it was very easy for me because I was just using these same old d4 ideas that I'd grown up on. So my opponent plays rook e8. He's trying to break with e6. I castle. And my idea here is I'm just getting settled. I'll break in the center soon enough. If he plays something like knight bd7, I could think about playing e5, but I do want to be a bit careful, right? Because knight g4 could be annoying. At this point, though, I think it already should be winning. Like, there's just too many threats here. I think already I can play e6 here, takes, and knight g5. This knight is hit by the queen. That was not a good arrow. This pawn is hit by the knight. Perhaps he could play check, king h1, and knight f2, and win an exchange, but I think after takes, this position really should be over. I would bet that this is winning. If we could turn on the evaluation here. Chess.com isn't working for me at the moment, but yeah, there must be something here. Something like queen f3, for instance. We're attacking this, we're attacking the bishop. They play rook f8. We play queen h3, we're attacking this pawn. If knight f6, at the very least white can take here and white is doing well, but is white winning though? I'm really not sure. I didn't analyze this in any depth. Anyway, suffice it to say, I don't need to play for e5 though. I can just keep going. I can just play something like h3 anticipating knight g4, and the idea is if his knight tries to squeak around to the g3 square, I'll play king h2, and I'm going to play g4 soon enough anyway. So instead, though, the man played e6. This is a classic idea. He's just trying to finally escape somehow. He wants to trade off pawns. If he can trade off pawns, he'll be able to free his position. He'll finally have an open file to put his rooks on. He'll start to have more squares for his minor pieces to place themselves on. It won't solve all his problems, but it will solve quite a lot of them. And in this position, I really wanted to open up my bishop, but I couldn't see how. My bishop wants to get all the way out here, because, first of all, the pin might be good here, and another thing is this d6 pawn could become very weak if my bishop can get to f4. So, with those things in mind, the move becomes obvious here. Initially, I had wanted to play h3, but then I didn't like knight h5, knight g3 stuff. It turns out in hindsight that this is my one inaccuracy of the game. Knight h5, g4, knight g3. I was afraid of that mouse getting in the house, but actually after rook e1, I'm just going to play king g2 and trap the knight. And everything is good. I was about to call it a bishop, but then I realized. So instead, though, I play f5. And the idea is I'm already crunching on a lot of his squares, a lot of his weak squares. We haven't really mentioned it, but I have a lot more pieces that are able to point into this whole king side than he is. If we look at his pieces, the bishop, the knight, the rook, none of these pieces are going to be able to really influence the king side. So f5 is doing quite a lot. I might be playing for an attack. I'm definitely opening up my bishop, and the opportunities my pieces are going to get are becoming quite serious. The guy took on f5. I took back. I still have good tension here. If he ever takes, he completely ruins his structure. He played knight d7. His knight is aiming for this nice score on e5. And if he has enough time, he might be able to do something with it. I should play quite quickly here. If he gets time for knight g4, his knight will sit on e5 very comfortably. I need to attack while e5 is still a bit under my control. I do have a knight defending it at the moment. I played bishop f4. I'm attacking the pawn here. He probably should play queen c7, but things are getting really, really ugly here. Maybe long term he could think about playing knight g4, knight takes knight to e5, but now with my rook shooting through, these things are just going to be very, very hard for him to ever achieve. I could even think about playing something like h3. If knight h5, just my bishop goes back. This is a super uncomfortable position. My bishop shoots through here. My bishop dominates the knight. I am going to force it back to the shadow realm with g4 in a second. And, you know, meanwhile, there's really nothing else for him to do. He's stuck. This bishop is just terrible. This is one of the worst parts of his entire position, just the fact that he is fully playing down a bishop here. That bishop is not doing anything. If it was on this diagonal, at least maybe it would have been able to help out in the fight for the f5 pawn. But, yeah, as it stands, his position is really suffering. Instead, though, he played knight e5. I took on e5 with the knight. He took with the pawn. And while he has managed to trade some pieces and get a pawn further into the center for the first time the entire game, he has given me a fantastic behemoth of a pawn on d5. This is a fantastic position for me. Normally we get these positions in the king's in with this pawn back here, and even then they're quite good. But with this pawn on f5, these positions are truly fantastic. They're truly sublime. Sublime's the word I'm looking for. We want to play bishop g5 here. Now I have pressure on f6. I'm threatening f takes g6. A byproduct of all of this is that this has turned into a position in which my knight has gotten a really brilliant square. There it is, a square on e4 for itself. Look at that. The knight is going to sit perfectly on e4. I talk about this a bit in my course. You know, when you have pawns on d5 and f5, a knight is the perfect complement to them. It's controlling both the squares in front of the pawns. It can normally be on an outpost if there's this pawn in the way. And yeah, this is just a fantastic position for me. Already my opponent is in really serious trouble. Most of this just has to do with the fact that my piece placement is so good. If his knight was here, his queen was somewhere else, and, you know, the position was more or less normal, then all of a sudden it would be okay. I mean pretty much a position like this in which his queen isn't hanging. It would be okay, or at least sort of salvageable, but as it stands, he's never going to be able to get this ideal setup with his knight blockading my strong pawn on d5. My strong pawn is just going to stay there, a strong protected pass pawn. There's no rush in moving it, though, of course, because it keeps the bishop to be so terrible on b7. That bishop is just pointing straight into the cement. So all in all, my opponent panics and plays queen d6. And in this position, knight e4 already looks good, but I need to just make it a little better. I chopped on f6, and he just resigned here. He's completely losing. It's already like +2. If queen takes f6, I just take g6. My rook is shooting through here, and this is fantastic. The queen moves out of the way. I'm going to take with the fork and pick up that mango on e8. Meanwhile, if he takes with a bishop, I just do the same trick. I play knight e4, queen e7, takes, and again g takes f7 is going to decide. So, yeah, I played my nearly perfect game. The only slight inaccuracy was that pawn push to f5, and even then that was a very justified, rational decision. This was really great to see. You know, this is a game that I used a lot of my prep from my bird course in. I also used a lot of my chess understanding from d4 positions in, because that's what this actually turned into. This just turned into a weird form of the King's Indian 4 pawns attack. And yeah, what a crazy position. I hope you enjoyed this. I hope you enjoyed this video. Let me know in the comments if I should post more of my highest rated wins, and I'll see you for the next one.